The afternoon of July 6, 1944, was warm and dry. Hartford sat under a clear summer sky, with little wind moving through the city. The Connecticut River ran quietly nearby, and streetcars moved along their regular routes. The United States was deep into the Second World War, but on this day, the conflict felt distant from the fairgrounds on Barber Street. By early afternoon, families began arriving in steady lines. Children walked ahead of their parents. Adults carried folded programs and small bags. The crowd moved toward a temporary city of canvas and ropes that had been raised on an open field. The large tent dominated the grounds, its pale surface reflecting the sun. Smaller tents surrounded it in neat rows. There was no sense of urgency. People found seats, greeted neighbors, and waited. Vendors moved through the aisles. Ushers guided late arrivals to open spaces. The performance had not yet reached its midpoint. Animals had already been let out and back in again. Applause came and went in waves. Nothing about the scene suggested risk. The tent had stood in many cities before. The routine was familiar. The ground beneath the benches was dry. The air inside the canvas enclosure was warm but manageable. For the thousands gathered inside, the afternoon appeared ordinary, structured, and safe. No one inside the tent understood that time had already begun to narrow. The circus that arrived in Hartford that summer was part of a long-established routine. The Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey Circus had been touring the United States for decades. By 1944, it was widely described as the greatest show on earth, a phrase that reflected both its scale and its reputation. Even during wartime, the company continued to travel, adjusting schedules and routes around fuel restrictions and rail availability. The tour moved largely by train. Equipment, animals, performers, and workers traveled together, arriving in each city early enough to raise the tents and prepare for scheduled performances. The big top was the center of operations. It was supported by steel poles and ropes anchored deep into the ground. Inside, wooden benches were assembled in concentric rings around a central performance area. Seating was temporary, designed to be erected and dismantled quickly. In the early 1940s, most large circus tents were made of heavy canvas. To reduce the risk of water damage and to improve durability, the fabric was commonly treated with waterproofing compounds. These mixtures often included paraffin wax and gasoline. The treatment was not unique to this circus. It was a standard industry practice at the time and was widely accepted as safe under normal conditions. Fire resistance was not yet a regulatory requirement for temporary structures of this kind. The audience reflected the city itself. Hartford was an industrial center with a mix of factory workers, office employees, and families connected to nearby military facilities. With many forms of travel limited by the war, large traveling shows held particular appeal. A circus performance offered an afternoon away from news reports, ration books, and casualty lists. For children, it was an event of color and movement. For adults, it was familiar and contained. Many of those attending on July 6 were children. School was out for the summer. Some had come in organized groups. Others were accompanied by parents or older siblings. The matinee performance was scheduled to attract families, and attendance reflected that intention. Estimates of the crowd size vary, but several thousand people were seated inside the main tent when the fire began. The workforce behind the performance was large and divided by role. Performers focused on rehearsed acts. Ushers and attendants were responsible for seating and crowd movement. A separate group handled animals, equipment, and maintenance. Fire safety, as a formal responsibility, was not clearly assigned. There were some precautionary measures in place. Buckets of water were positioned near certain poles. Fire extinguishers existed but were few and not easily accessible to the public. Local authorities had inspected the grounds, as was customary. There were no reports of violations that stood out at the time. The event had been advertised openly and approved through standard municipal channels. From an administrative perspective, the circus was operating within accepted norms. Inside the tent, the show followed a predictable rhythm. Acts rotated in and out. Music played between performances. The audience's attention shifted frequently, directed toward the center ring and then to the periphery as performers entered and exited. Movement within the seating areas was constant but controlled. This sense of order mattered. The audience trusted the structure around them. The tent had been raised that morning and appeared solid. The ropes were taut. The poles were stable. Nothing in the visible arrangement suggested fragility. The systems in place were designed for efficiency, not emergency. By the time the afternoon performance was underway, the circus had become what it always intended to be, a temporary environment that felt permanent for a few hours. It was within this ordinary setting, shaped by habit and expectation, that a single, brief event would begin to unravel the assumptions holding it together. The fire began near the sidewall of the main tent, away from the central ring. The exact source was never established with certainty. Several eyewitnesses later reported seeing a small flame rise along the canvas wall, no larger at first than a hand. Others recalled the smell of smoke before they saw anything unusual. What is known is that ignition occurred while the performance was still in progress. At first, the flame did not draw immediate attention. The canvas walls were high, and most eyes were directed toward the performers. When the fire was noticed, it appeared localized. An attempt was made to address it using available buckets of water. These efforts failed almost immediately. The treated canvas ignited and carried the fire upward rather than extinguishing it. Once the flame reached higher sections of the tent, the fire spread rapidly. The waterproofing compound embedded in the fabric burned intensely. Heat moved across the ceiling of the big top in seconds, traveling faster than people on the ground could react. Burning material began to fall inward. The structure of the tent played a critical role. The big top was supported by a system of poles and ropes that depended on tension. As the canvas burned, that tension changed. The roof began to sag unevenly. Smoke accumulated quickly, reducing visibility. The temperature inside the tent rose sharply. Audience members started to stand. Movement increased along the aisles. Ushers attempted to guide people toward exits, but the number of available openings was limited. Some exits were partially obstructed by equipment, ropes, or guy lines used to stabilize the tent. Others were not clearly marked. Panic was not immediate, but confusion was. Many people hesitated, uncertain whether to remain seated or leave. Parents searched for children. Children followed movement without understanding its direction. The sound of the performance stopped, replaced by shouting and the noise of shifting benches. Within moments, the fire reached a point where it could no longer be contained. Burning canvas dropped into the seating areas. The tent's interior, once evenly lit, became dim and irregular. Smoke made breathing difficult. Orientation became harder as familiar reference points disappeared. At this point, the situation had changed irreversibly. The environment that had felt stable minutes earlier was now actively hostile. Escape routes were narrowing rather than opening. The crowd size, which had once been a sign of success, now limited movement. There was no single signal that marked the transition from incident to disaster. It unfolded as a series of small failures occurring faster than they could be corrected. By the time many understood the seriousness of the fire, the opportunity for orderly evacuation had already passed. The tent was no longer a shelter. It had become a collapsing boundary. As the fire moved across the ceiling, the interior of the tent changed in stages rather than all at once. Smoke collected first at the highest point, then descended unevenly. Light filtered through gaps where the canvas burned away, creating shifting patches of brightness and shadow. The air became hot and thick. Breathing required effort. People began moving toward the perimeter. The aisles were narrow, designed for orderly entry and exit under normal conditions. Wooden benches, loosely secured, shifted as bodies pressed against them. Some benches tipped. Others broke apart. This created additional obstacles, forcing people to climb, step over, or turn back. The tent's exits were not evenly distributed. Many were cut into the canvas walls and marked only by visual familiarity rather than signage. As the fire spread along the sidewalls, some exits disappeared entirely. Flames traveled downward as well as across the roof. In several places, ropes and guy lines fell into passageways, forming low barriers that people tripped over in the smoke. Witness accounts describe a rapid loss of orientation. The interior had been symmetrical, but once the canvas burned and collapsed in sections, that symmetry vanished. People moved toward what they believed were exits, only to encounter walls of flame or impassable congestion. Some reversed direction multiple times, losing valuable seconds. Children were particularly vulnerable. Many were seated in the lower rows, closer to the performance ring. When adults stood abruptly, sightlines disappeared. Smaller bodies were pushed by the movement of the crowd. Some were lifted by adults they did not know, carried a short distance, then set down again when movement stalled. Others were separated from family members almost immediately. Heat intensified as burning canvas dropped inward. Pieces of flaming material landed on clothing and wooden benches. Some people attempted to beat out flames with their hands or roll on the ground. Others tore off burning garments. These actions slowed movement but were often necessary to prevent further injury. The tent's central poles remained standing longer than the surrounding canvas. This created a brief period in which the roof sagged but did not fully collapse. During this time, smoke density increased sharply. Many survivors later reported that they could no longer see more than a few feet ahead. Movement became instinctive rather than directed. Exits on the downwind side of the tent became choke points. As more people converged on fewer openings, pressure built from behind. Some individuals fell and were unable to regain their footing. Others stepped over them, sometimes without realizing it. The ground surface, dry and uneven, offered little traction. Outside the tent, the fire was visible from a distance. Flames rose above the remaining canvas. Those who escaped first attempted to pull others through openings. In some cases, canvas walls were cut or torn to create new exits. These improvised openings saved lives but were not created quickly enough to relieve congestion everywhere. Inside, time perception altered. Survivors later described the event as lasting much longer than it did. In reality, the most intense phase of the fire unfolded over a matter of minutes. The speed of combustion, driven by the treated canvas, outpaced human reaction. There was little opportunity for coordination or instruction. Emergency response began while the fire was still active. Local firefighters arrived quickly, but access was limited by the collapsing structure and the density of people. Water streams were directed at the remaining canvas to prevent further spread, but by that point, the interior conditions had already caused extensive harm. Medical assistance was improvised. Injured individuals were laid out on the ground outside the tent. Nearby buildings, vehicles, and open spaces became temporary treatment areas. Doctors and nurses who were in the audience or nearby responded without formal organization. Supplies were limited. Burns and smoke inhalation were the most common injuries. Within the tent, the final collapse occurred as the remaining canvas lost structural integrity. Poles fell inward. Any remaining pockets of shelter disappeared. Those still inside were either incapacitated or trapped by debris. The fire continued to burn material already on the ground, prolonging exposure to heat and smoke. The disaster did not unfold uniformly. Some sections of the audience escaped with relatively minor injuries. Others experienced extreme conditions almost immediately. Survival depended heavily on location, timing, and chance. There were no systematic protections once the fire reached a certain point. By the time the flames were brought under control, the tent was largely destroyed. What remained was a field of debris, scattered belongings, and injured people. The performance space no longer existed as a defined area. The boundaries that had once organized the crowd had vanished. The event left behind more than physical damage. It exposed how quickly a familiar environment could become lethal when materials, design, and emergency planning failed simultaneously. Inside the burning tent, survival was not a matter of strength or preparation. It was shaped by seconds, by proximity to an exit, and by the unpredictable movement of others. When the fire finally subsided, the immediate danger ended. The consequences, however, were only beginning to emerge. When the fire was largely extinguished, the area around the former tent became a triage ground. People who had escaped stood in place, many unable to move further. Others searched the perimeter, calling out names. Shoes, hats, programs, and pieces of clothing were scattered across the field. The scale of injury was immediately apparent, but its full extent was not yet understood. Emergency services were quickly overwhelmed. Ambulances transported the most severely injured to nearby hospitals, including Hartford Hospital and St. Francis Hospital. Hallways, waiting rooms, and adjacent buildings filled with patients. Doctors and nurses worked continuously, often without complete information about who had been brought in or where they had come from. Burn treatment protocols were limited by the medical knowledge and resources of the time. Many victims suffered from smoke inhalation rather than visible burns. Some appeared stable initially but deteriorated hours later as respiratory damage progressed. Others arrived with extensive burns that required immediate attention. The volume of patients strained supplies of plasma, dressings, and pain medication. Volunteers assisted where possible, performing basic tasks and helping to identify the injured. Outside the hospital system, the process of accounting for the missing began. Families moved between hospitals, temporary morgues, and police stations. Lists were posted and updated repeatedly as new information arrived. Identification was complicated by the condition of many bodies and by the fact that children had often attended without formal identification. As the evening progressed, fatalities were confirmed. Some deaths occurred at the scene. Others followed later in medical facilities. The number rose steadily as hours passed. Officials avoided announcing a final count, acknowledging that it would take time to determine how many had been present and how many remained unaccounted for. The psychological impact on survivors was immediate but uneven. Some spoke freely about what they had seen. Others remained silent. Children who survived often had little understanding of what had occurred, while adults struggled to reconcile the speed and scale of the event. Many reported difficulty sleeping in the days that followed. These responses were noted but not formally treated in most cases. City officials secured the site. Investigators began documenting the remains of the tent and surrounding equipment. Attention focused on the materials used in construction, the placement of exits, and the response to the initial ignition. Witness statements were collected methodically. There was no single narrative that explained all outcomes. Experiences varied widely depending on where individuals had been seated and how quickly they were able to move. By the end of the day, it was clear that the event was among the deadliest fires in the city's history. The field that had hosted a performance hours earlier had become a place of loss. The routine nature of the afternoon only heightened the contrast. As night fell over Hartford, hospitals remained active, and families continued to wait for news. The fire itself was over. What remained was the task of counting the dead, caring for the injured, and understanding how a public event had resulted in such widespread harm. In the days following the fire, officials worked to establish an accurate death toll. This process unfolded slowly. Some victims had died at the scene. Others succumbed to injuries after being admitted to hospitals. A number of children were initially listed as missing, their identities unknown. Only after days of cross-checking hospital records, witness statements, and family reports did a clearer picture emerge. The final official count was set at 167 deaths. This number reflected those who were confirmed to have died as a direct result of the fire and its immediate effects. It did not include individuals who may have suffered long-term health consequences. The figure has remained unchanged in official records, though uncertainty persisted for years regarding the identities of a small number of victims. Investigations were conducted by local authorities with support from state agencies, including the Connecticut State Police. The focus was not limited to the cause of ignition. Investigators examined crowd control, emergency preparedness, tent construction, and the chemical treatment of the canvas. No single individual was conclusively identified as responsible for starting the fire. Legal consequences followed. Several circus officials were charged with negligence related to safety practices. Some received prison sentences, while others were fined. Civil lawsuits were filed by victims' families and survivors. Financial settlements were reached over time, though compensation varied and often fell short of covering long-term needs. Beyond the courtroom, regulatory changes began to take shape. The use of flammable waterproofing treatments was prohibited. Fire-resistant materials became mandatory for large public tents. Exit requirements were revised, and inspection standards were strengthened. These measures were implemented gradually but reflected lessons drawn directly from the event. The accounting of the dead brought administrative closure, but not resolution. Names were added to records. Causes of death were recorded. The fire entered official history as a defined event with a fixed number. For families and survivors, the loss did not align neatly with documentation. The disaster was no longer unfolding. It had become a fact. The Hartford Circus fire did not fade quietly into memory. Its consequences extended beyond the city and beyond the summer of 1944. In the years that followed, fire safety regulations across the United States changed in measurable ways. Temporary structures were no longer treated as exceptions. Materials once considered acceptable were reclassified as hazards. The disaster altered how risk was understood in public spaces. It demonstrated that routine events could carry systemic danger when design, materials, and planning failed together. These lessons were absorbed gradually, through policy revisions rather than public ceremony. The fire is remembered not for a single error, but for the absence of safeguards. It remains one of the deadliest fires involving a public gathering in American history. Its legacy is largely invisible, embedded in codes and standards that prevent similar conditions from forming again. The field where the tent once stood returned to ordinary use. The afternoon did not repeat itself. What endured was a quieter change, one measured not in spectacle, but in prevention.